The old gods have returned for madness at the Darkmoon Faire. That's right, the expansion just got announced. In this video, I'm going to talk about probably the craziest cards we've ever seen in Hearthstone. I don't even think that's an exaggeration at all. If you're looking for news on the new game mode that also got announced today, you can check out my other video I posted today for some details on that and my first ever duels run. But for now, we're going to take a look at these absolutely bonkers old gods cards, new keyword, etc. Starting off here with Yogg, the Master of Fate, same cost and stat line we all know and love. Battle Cry, if you've cast 10 spells this game, spin the wheel of Yogg. So a little bit carnival themed here. And you might be wondering what the wheel of Yogg is. Well, here it is. It's 6 choices. 5 of them have a 19% chance. 1 of them has a 5% chance. That's Rod of Roasting. Yeah, I'll let you guys comment about that. We will stay out of any sort of commentary in this video. We're going to stick to power level discussions. We'll save that one for a later date. But Rod of Roasting will cast Pyroblast randomly until a player dies. Hand of Fate fills your hand with random spells. They cost 0 this turn. That's like a crazy evocation. Curse of Flesh will fill the board, both your side and your opponent's side, with random minions. Yours will get Rush, so potentially allowing you to trade down swing, particularly if your opponent already has a pretty sizable board that might help you flip things back to neutral or even in your favor. Mind Flayer Goggles take control of 3 random enemy minions, so like 3 mind control attacks with no board size requirement. Mystery Box is straight up just old school Yogg. You're going to cast a bunch of random spells, and Devouring Hunger will destroy all other minions, friendly and enemy, and Yogg will gain their attack and health, making for an enormous Yoggy boy sometimes. And basically, all of these are just ridiculously absurd power levels, and in many cases will allow you to completely steal a game that you would otherwise lost. I mean, Hand of Fate is like, potentially 10 free cards in hand. That's bonkers. Curse of Flesh allows you to build a big board and value trade. If your opponent has a bunch of 1/1s, you're going to win out a ton. If they don't, you might still be able to clear their board at the very least, or maybe leave behind a few things. Mind Flayer Goggles, huge swing. We all know original Yogg, OG Yogg, can cause chaos for Mystery Box, and Devouring Hunger is just an enormous, twisting nether with this crazy upside of a giant minion. So, yeah, I mean, all of these are great. And the really cool thing about it is they're all good from behind, with other cards in the past, like Death Knight cards from the Lich King, some were good when you're ahead, some were good behind. So the fact that they could kind of be different game states that are rewarded would be almost problematic in a way. It's like sometimes I'd need pressure and I'd get a removal card. With this particular set of cards, you want to play this when you're behind, which means you have a consistent and reliable time to actually drop your Yogg and get a result that you expect and want. Now, that said, Yogg's not going to be very good when you're ahead. There's just a lot of risk. I mean, Hand of Fate could be good if you're ahead in some cases, but you're only going to get that, 19% of the time, and the other ones might completely ruin your board state. So Yogg has some natural checks there. You have to have the 10 spells cast in order to get him off, and you kind of have to be behind. But that said, lots of decks are fine playing from behind. And even like OG Yogg was a great tool in competitive Hearthstone because you knew he was like your get out of jail free card. If everything else failed, throw down Yogg, flip the game, try to steal a win. And I think this Yogg does that, but perhaps even more reliably and more consistently than in the past, because some of these are just so darn good as results and they all work in the same direction. So I think here Yogg is as good as it's ever been. Now, of course, not every deck's going to want to run 10 spells. Not everybody can play this card, but with all the different spell generations out there, it's going to fit into a ton of different Hearthstone decks, and it's going to be the perfect top-end card that gives you that, bailout, Hail Mary sort of win condition that some decks do indeed desire. So I think we're going to see a lot of Yogg, and that's potentially going to be very frustrating, but also very, very, very crazy and probably pretty fun. So next up here, let's take a look at Cthun the Shattered. Cthun coming back, same cost and stats. Start a game, break into pieces, and then Battle Cry, deal 30 damage randomly split among all enemies. So there are 4 pieces to Cthun that you'll see there on the right side of the screen. Each of them are 5 mana spells. Essentially, at the start of the game, All of those 5-mana spells will be shuffled into your deck. You'll draw them each. Once you play them, the counter for Cthulhu will go up. Once it gets to 4, I'm told, Cthulhu the Shattered will be shuffled into your deck, not your hand, so you'll then have to draw Cthulhu, and then play Cthulhu for his big nasty battle cry here, which can either clear a board or maybe just outright kill your opponent. Now, when it comes to the pieces of Cthulhu, they're like solid cards for 5 mana. You got an Avenging Wrath style with Eye of Cthulhu, Heart of Cthulhu, sort of a Hellfire board clear sort of thing that doesn't go face. Body Cthulhu is just a big taunt body, and Maw of Cthulhu is an assassinate, essentially. So these aren't great cards. Some of them are going to feel slow or awkward. They're not cards that you'd run in your deck otherwise. In most cases, perhaps 1 or 2 could be, depending on the deck type. So it's true that you're going to shuffle 4 mediocre cards into your deck. You're going to have to draw 4 mediocre cards, spend 20 mana on 4 mediocre cards, and then finally draw Cthulhu for that big upside play. And I will say Cthulhu's solid. I mean, I think he's going to be really good. Obviously, dealing 30 is amazing. But it's not like an inherent win condition. It doesn't always win you the game when you play it. Your opponent might have a couple 10 drops on board, and Cthulhu just kind of chips away at them without doing anything too crazy. So I actually think Cthulhu has a little bit of a challenge here to overcome to be a really competitively viable card, because I think a lot of work goes into it, a lot of time and mana, and not many decks are going to be able to invest that for the payoff here, which again is a big payoff. I don't want to play down how insane it is to deal 30 damage to the board, but it's not like, you know, Mechathune where it's guaranteed to win you the game when it happens. It's just gonna be a big swing. And some opponents will be able to recover from that, frankly, whether that's just by having a ton of health with like Warrior or just having a big board of stuff. So I think a lot of work for a great but not instant game-winning payoff is perhaps problematic. That said, there are still certainly some control decks that are fine playing towards a grindy game plan like this, and most of these cards are more defensive in nature as well, which means they're not necessarily hard for a control deck to squeeze into turns. So I'm sure Cthulhu will find a home in some slower, grindier deck out there as that big payoff card, kind of backup win condition or a way to close out games. But keep in mind, his stats don't grow like the OG Cthulhu, so he is just going to be a 6/6 on board in those cases, which means it's really all about the battle cry here to create the necessary pressure. But, you know, any other battle cry synergies or whatever could help expand on this as well. So what I'm saying here essentially is a reasonable card, solid card, but I don't think necessarily one we see everywhere all the time. Moving on to Nzoth, God of the Deep, same stat and cost. Battlecry here is resurrect a friendly minion of each minion type. So instead of Death Rattle synergies, we have Menagerie synergies this time around for Nzoth, God of the Deep, which is pretty cool. You get a big board of a bunch of random crazy minion types. Clearly, if you can do that, if you can get 6 minions, this will be a great tool to present one of those big reloads. We've seen that work like Nzoth in the past. Tons of other cards have succeeded in that fashion. That said, though, after reviewing the sort of available cards for minion types, I think there's going to be some awkwardness here. For instance, if you go by class, a lot of classes have, you know, a minion type or two they tend to focus on, but don't really move much beyond that. So, of course, like Druid and Hunter have Beast, and Shaman has Totem, and Rogue perhaps has Pirates, and Warrior has Mechs. And there might be a few, you know, notable exceptions where there's another great minion type card that fits into one of those classes. But as you start to get beyond like 2 to 3 minion types, suddenly it's like, man, there's not much else to choose from. There's some great general stuff like Siamat is an elemental. There are a lot, of course, of big dragons that you can toss in for Nzoth. But getting beyond 2 to 3 to 4 is really hard. So I don't know how often this is going to be that big full board reload, other than perhaps decks that are randomly generating a ton of cards that may not have started in their deck, but they're generating some random beast that gets summoned off of Nzoth. So there's still that potential there for this to go crazy, but I think more often than not, this is going to be like 4 minions summoned off of Nzoth. Now that said, sometimes that might be enough, particularly if the minions are amazing. If you're getting like a King Crush out of Nzoth, that alone is cool, but you know, a Siamat to boot, whatever else would be amazing. So you could envision some like Highlander Hunter maybe runs this for a few hits to make this a good top end card. Is it better than the Grand Slam? Debatable, but still a potential option for those sorts of decks that need that big follow-up in the late game, or maybe just have 3 really solid minions they're bringing back, like say in a Fat Druid, For instance, with one big mech, one big dragon, one big beast, that could do enough to make Nzoth worth it. So you do see a few angles of play here, but I don't think this often becomes that gigantic, insane, super game-winning reload. More of just a general value sort of card, unless, of course, Blizzard expands into more menagerie support by printing one like really good neutral beast, one really good neutral elemental or pirate or demon or whatever it might be. So we'll keep an eye out for more options here for the future for Nzoth. So as it stands, still a card with some play, just not, an absolute amazing everywhere sort of card. And probably not even as good as our previous Nzoth. So next up here is Yashraj the Defiler, 10 mana, 10/10. Battlecry, add a copy of each corrupted card you've played this game to your hand. They cost 0 this turn. Corrupted, you may not know what that is. Let's talk about it. Corrupt is a new keyword in Darkmoon Faire. Here is one example. Essentially, to activate a card with Corrupt, you have to play a card of a higher mana cost while the Corrupt card is in your hand. So for the Pearl Tusk here, it's sitting in hand. You have to play a 6 mana or higher cost card to activate the Corrupt. This becomes Corrupted, which turns it into an 8/8. Some other examples include Day at the Fair, which goes from summoning 3 Silverhand Recruits to 5, and Dunk Tank, which adds an AoE effect to its base single target damage, meaning at the end of the day, cards like these will be supported for Yashraj, so you could play Yashraj and add 2 0-mana 8/8s to your hand off of the Fleet Hoof Pearl Tusks there that have Rush, mind you, or whatever other crazy corrupt cards, making for some really big swing turn potential in the vein of things like Dragon Queen Alexstrasza, where you're playing this one big base body and following it up with some really cheap stuff to do. If your deck's running a handful of corrupted cards, then Yashraj is clearly going to be an enormous swing turn, probably of the game deciding fashion, just because it could be like 8 burst damage off of Dunk Tank, or a big board swing and reload off of the Fleet Hoof Pearl Tusks, etc. Now, I don't know if Day at the Fair is great with the Yashraj, but clearly there will be more corrupted cards. Now, I'm going to refrain from fully reviewing this one yet because we don't know exactly what kind of corrupted cards are out there, but the potential is certainly there. Even if 1 or 2 decks are using corrupted at all, Yashraj is going to be an enormous late game payoff that's probably worth running, and in some cases might even be worth running corrupted specifically just because Yashraj is going to be so awesome. So keep an eye out for this one, control decks, Highlander decks, etc. So moving back into the corrupted cards themselves here, starting off with the Pearl Tusk. This is a 5 mana 4/4 beast with Rush by default. You play that higher cost card. This turns into an 8/8 with Rush, which is clearly pretty big for 5 mana. Now, before we get into the details of this specific card, I want to talk about Corrupt a little bit as a keyword and how I think it could be rather awkward in many cases, because essentially to gain the upsides of this card, you're pushing them later and later into the game. For this one, for instance, it's probably not being played before turn 7 if you're kind of playing by the rules from a mana curve standpoint, because you have to play that 6 mana card first to make your Pearl Tusk get corrupted. So you're not playing this on 5 and you're not playing it on 6, you're playing it on 7, which could create some awkward mana gaps for a card like this one in particular, and really any of them is going to be their base cost +2 before it really makes sense to play it on that given turn. And are you going to be able to squeeze in other things that make sense and support the card? I don't know. Beyond that, these corrupted cards have to be in hand when you play that higher cost card to activate. So you're sitting on them dead in hand for a while until they get corrupted. And alternatively, if you top deck them, they're just not going to get corrupted until a future turn, which could also be, in some cases, problematic. I do think there's some real awkwardness here around using these cards, squeezing them into turns when they're going to be good. And I don't know. I mean, I haven't played these yet, so it's hard to see these things in action. But I think only decks that are playing for a pretty slow game plan and trying to grind out late game scenarios are really going to be able to use these at all, because otherwise you're going to be trying to keep up as much as possible against much faster decks. And I don't know that a card like this one has the swing potential necessary to make that worth it. If you're playing this on turn 7, it's competing against things like, Guardian Animals of old, and I just don't think this keeps up with what we've seen from turn 7s in Hearthstone these days. Your opponent might be playing Dino Tamer Brand while you're playing a Fleet Hoof Pearl Tusk, and I think you lose out in that exchange. So I don't know if this card has that follow-up necessary or the swing potential necessary as it stands from just being that big stat body that perhaps isn't enough even with Rush, because of how far back you're pushing it into the game. And at a base level, this card is not very exciting to me at all. We've got better alternatives at lower mana costs that just aren't necessarily great cards themselves, just compared to like Faceless Corruptor. At the same mana cost, you can see some of the issues. And then even like Dragon Maw Poacher was a card that would be a 4 mana 8/8 with Rush. Even with a ton of dragons in the meta, that card wasn't necessarily insane. This one just looks a little bit weaker. So Corrupted as a keyword has some potential hesitations for me, and this card in particular, same story. That said, if Yashraj is good enough, if you just need Corrupted, you could toss this in as a bonus and maybe not even care, because you know you're going to get that 0 mana 8/8 down the road. Your deck's so grindy, so greedy, that this is sort of a freebie that makes its way in just because you're running so much Corrupted stuff anyway. That's the only real way I see this card making a lot of sense. I don't think it gets there otherwise. Moving on to Day at the Fair here. 3 mana Corrupt Paladin card. It's going to summon you 3 Silverhand Recruits at a base. Corrupted, it turns into 5. By the way, I love the alternate artwork on these cards. It's hilarious. It's a turkey leg, like grew teeth and eyes and stuff, which is amazing. Now, for this one, you know, at a base level, I think this card's okay. I think often you're fine with spending 3 mana to get 3 minions on board. If you've got a token deck that's happy to do that, you know, whether that's the side quest that's going to buff a bunch of stuff, or you got a Brazen Zealot that's growing. There is a token Paladin game plan that works in Hearthstone to some extent these days, and I think even the base Day at the Fair could support that, even if it's worse than other 3 mana cards that have done similar things, say like Muster for Battle, classic example. And then you've got this also this potential upside to make it summon 5, which is clearly really, really good for 3 mana. That alone could activate the Paladin side quest, buff them all to 2/2s, so on, so forth. Now, that said, I think this card works really well in an aggro environment. That's usually the kinds of decks that are wanting to go wide and create lots of pressure on board via minions in the early game. And unfortunately for Corrupt as a keyword, I don't think it fits very well in aggro, because you're not going to want to hold this card until turn 5. You're often going to want to play things in curve as quickly as possible, and therefore waiting until turn 5 to play your Corrupted version with the full upside may not be worth it. Plus, you kind of have to have that 4 mana card. You couldn't play like 2 2-drops on turn 4. You'd have to play the 4 mana card to make this one worth it. If you top deck it, it's the same problem. So I think Corrupted makes more sense in those slower decks. This card makes more sense in faster decks, which means those two things are sort of at odds with each other and might really hold this one back. That said, even at a base level, there are still some decks that could run it, so it might be a solid card nonetheless. Moving on here to Dunk Tank for Shaman, a 4 mana spell. It deals 4 damage at a base that can go face or to minions. And then when Corrupted, this will deal 2 damage to all enemy minions. So it becomes a consecration that goes face for 4 instead of for 2. Also, you could clear, say, a 6/6 and a bunch of 2 health minions with Dunk Tank as well if you wanted to use it specifically for removal. So a pretty nifty card here. If you're playing this, you know, in a control deck, which Shaman could do, you've got this, you know, single target upside on it. You can also just go face with it, which is nice for some control decks to have that ability to kind of turn the corner and create some counter pressure. Using this as a finisher would be really cool. I could also even see this in a deck that just runs a lot of burst damage and has a bunch of spells, spell damage Shaman in combination with, you know, those lightning bolts and Serpent Shrine portals and lava burst. Dunk Tank could follow in right there, help you kind of keep boards in check sometimes while also just presenting that same lethal output to face. So I think this one's a little bit more flexible than other Corrupt cards, because sometimes that 4 mana for 4 is going to be fine when you're trying to end the game, and other times you're thrilled that you've got this consecration with some significant upside. And if you're playing a slower style, then certainly corrupting this won't matter much. Now, that said, it's not going to be great on turn 4, like Consecration, to sort of stop that early aggression, that crazy Demon Hunter board that was built out, because it's not going to be corrupted yet on turn 4. So the question is, will that 2 damage to all enemy minions scale hard enough once this is moved late enough into the game to become corrupted? That might be the issue. If your opponent's playing a bunch of 5/5s by then, maybe Dunk Tank doesn't quite get there. So again, the corrupted aspect of this card kind of seems to put some checks on its power level. But nonetheless, I think the flexibility and the raw damage output are probably enough that this pops into a deck here and there. Perhaps more importantly, it just exists in random generation pools for Shaman. So moving on here to Sylas Darkmoon, a new neutral legendary that I think might be in the game today. I think we might be able to play this one early, much like Kale Thoss. He's a 7 mana 4/4 with Battlecry. Choose a direction to rotate all minions. You can rotate them clockwise or counterclockwise. What that means is If your opponent has a 1/1 and a 12/12 on board, you could play Sylas, rotate that 12/12 to your side of the board, pushing your Sylas to their side of the board, essentially trading your 4/4 for their 12/12. If you had a lackey on board as well, you could create a scenario where you push the 1/1 lackey to their side of the board and steal their 12/12. If there's only one minion, you're just going to swap your Sylas for their minion no matter which way you choose. So it's this sort of soft mind control for 7 mana that swaps a 4/4 to their side of the board, or perhaps a weaker minion. You could even do things like have a Doomsayer of your own that you push to your opponent's side of the board to create a board clear scenario, which is kind of a sneaky shenanigan, maybe even stealing their Death Rattle minion in the process. Now, of course, there are some positional requirements to make all of this work. You can manipulate your side of the board a lot easier than your opponent's side of the board, but if you want to steal that specific thing, it has to be on an outside edge in particular in order to do that. So that might be an issue where if this ever became super meta relevant, people learn to play around it and position boards carefully. But in that Doomsayer scenario, this could still be a really cool board clear tool. That kind of 2-card board clear some decks could use, with the occasional upside of a mind control that steals your opponent's Rattlegore, for instance. So I do think this could pop into a deck here and there. It's got some sneaky potential, even though it looks kind of weird and looks kind of awkward at first glance. There's some play on this card for sure. Moving on to Kiri, Chosen of Elune for Druid, a new legendary minion. It's a 4-mana 2/2, Battlecry, add a Solar Eclipse and a Lunar Eclipse to your card. I love the visuals on this card. The Moonkin, the beautiful spell effects here. Lunar Eclipse is a 2-mana spell. Deal 3 damage to a minion. Your next spell this turn costs 2 less. You've also got Solar Eclipse, which your next spell this turn cast twice. So some real shenanigans possible here with these 2 cards. For instance, Solar Eclipse with Kael'thas, you could make your 1-mana Survival of the Fittest go off twice, buffing everything you have by 8/8. That's sort of ridiculous. You could even just swipe twice sometimes, perhaps, and be pretty happy off of the Solar Eclipse. You've also got some Lunar Eclipse shenanigans there with the cost discounts, enabling you to set up even better Kael'thas turns, squeeze things out while removing a minion sort of for free. And of course, these spells have some interactions together as well, where you could discount the Solar Eclipse, you could cast the Lunar Eclipse twice, so on, so forth. Most importantly, perhaps, is just that Druid loves cheap spells right now. We have so many synergies with Kael'thas and Mount Sellers and so on that I think a card that you're able to play early, which cycles you into a couple spells, both of which have enormous upside, really fits the Druid game plan nicely. I don't see how this card doesn't get played. It just makes way too much sense. It has some broken potential with Solar Eclipse. This one looks really, really strong to me. Next up here is Guess the Weight for Druid. I love the flavor of this one. It's 2 mana, you draw a card, guess if the next card costs more or less to draw it. So if you guess correctly, you get 2 cards drawn here for 2 mana, which is pretty nice. If you don't guess correctly, 1 card drawn is kind of iffy. But you also perhaps get a little bit of insight into what your next card could be if you guess incorrectly. So, if you have an overgrowth and you guess, okay, I think the next card is going to be higher, and you fail, maybe that means you're going to get a cheap spell off the top of your deck, and that could help you make better decisions. So there's some upside here, even if things do backfire a little bit. I love the flavor of this because Druid's all about choosing anyway, so that's really fun. It adds a skill element based on the remaining cards in your deck. Also, Druid is a deck with a pretty binary cost. In many cases, there's like a lot of cheap spells and a lot of big stuff. So Survival of the Fittest, if you draw that, your next card's going to be cheaper, so you're good to go. If you get Moonfire, your next card is going to be more expensive. So there are some pretty obvious breakpoints. I would guess you get this right like 75% of the time, maybe, just because the way Druid decks are typically structured, which means it's maybe worth it. I don't know, though, that 2 mana draw 2, even best case, is really gonna be that great. Like, clearly it's good, but there's other options too, like Rising Winds and even Wrath, that draw you cards that have upsides as well, or board impacts or flexibility. And I don't know if the upside here is consistent enough or just big enough to make it worth it compared to other things. That said, some of those cards may rotate out. This is left behind in rotation. Eventually down the road becomes a card draw tool for Druid, but only in specific decks, only in certain environments does that really work out. So I think it's probably a fine card that will pop into a random, very spell-centric deck here and there, but doesn't become a staple for Druid necessarily. Next appears the Darkmoon Rabbit. Ridiculous 10 mana 1/1 rush, poisonous. It's got a cleave effect as well, which means it's basically a board clear on 3 minions minus any Divine Shield shenanigans. Or taunt shenanigans as well, because it's going to hit that first one. It's going to cleave. The poisonous affects all 3 because it's dealing damage. And that means it's still not very good. Because spending 10 mana to remove 3 minions, it's probably okay, but it's not something you're going to put in your deck or run, because it's just such a big commitment. We have way better wide board removal in Hearthstone. There's Brawls, there's Twisting Nethers, etc. That this would just be way too awkward. I think this card exists to sort of disrupt and change the 10 mana minion pool, in some cases for better, in many cases for worse, for decks that are trying to summon big stats, in particular off random 10 drops. Think about like Wild format with Spiteful Summoners. Even now, like, you know, evolving your Mogu Flesh Shaper or something, you might be less excited to get a 1/1 if you're trying to build a big threat instead of like a Scrapyard Colossus, for instance. So I think this card's just a funny meme, sort of hilarious, you know, Darkmoon crazy evil rabbit that's fun and amazing, and I'm sort of glad it's in the game to disrupt those evolve pools, but not a card that ever makes it into an actual deck list. I can't think of many reasons to run a card like this one. I think it's pretty weak from a constructed standpoint. And then finally here, the Fortune Teller for Priest, a 5-mana 3/3 taunt mech with a battle cry gain +1/+1 for each spell in your hand. So if you had like 9 spells left when playing this one, I guess you could have yourself a little 12/12 on board. I think more regularly you'd probably have something like, I don't know, 3 to 6 spells in hand. So this is probably like a 6/6 to a 9/9, maybe. Probably on average a 6/6 to 7/7, somewhere in there, which, you know, is solid. In a big threat taunts like this have seen some success in the past, not necessarily in Priest. Priest is usually more about shenanigans or disruption when they're interacting with the opponent's board, as opposed to just raw stats in play. So think about like Convincing Infiltrator and Cabal Acolyte. That's generally the Priest game plan, more than just dumping big stuff. So I don't know that this makes sense in Priest today, as we certainly understand Priest right now. I think Priest likes disruption in their game plan more than just raw bodies, but, you know, Convincing Infiltrator is going to rotate out. This will be left behind. Maybe it becomes that mid-game card that they need instead of like Sandhoof or Convincing. This could certainly fill in that slot. If the deck in particular runs a lot of spells and this starts moving up to 8/8, 9/9 more reliably, it just becomes harder and harder to deal with. I'm sure a deck could make it work. I think it's probably more important off random generation than anything else, but nonetheless, a really solid card. Yogg is a 5-star card. Cthun is a 4-star card. Nzoth is a 4-star card. Yashraj is a 4-star card. Fleet Hoof Pearl Tusk is a 3-star card. Day at the Fair is a 3-star card. Dunk Tank is a 4-star card. Sylas Darkmoon is a 4-star card. Kiri Chosen of Elune is a 5-star card. Guess the Weight is a 3-star card. Darkmoon Rabbit is a 2-star card. Fortune Teller is a 3-star card. And there you go, folks. That wraps it up for this review. Some insane cards. It's hard to get a read on some of these still. We may update some of these thoughts in the future as we see more corrupted cards, more menagerie cards, more cards, which means you better stay tuned for future reviews. We're going to have a lot coming, as always, as soon as the cards are out. You guys know how it works. Really, who cares what I have to say? I like to post videos quickly so you guys have a place to talk about it. Share your thoughts. Tell me why I'm wrong. Tell me why you're right. I want to hear all that in the comments below. That said, we're going to be talking about all these cards on Twitch as well. I'm going to be streaming a ton for the new game mode duel, so swing by my Twitch stream. There should be links down there in the description and comments below. Come hang out. Ask me about cards. Tell me I'm crazy. Love to see you. Love to chat about it. So hope to see you there. That said, thanks much for watching this video. Stay tuned for more in the near future. Hit that subscribe button, I guess, if you want to see more videos. If not, YouTube will probably find you anyway. We'll hunt you down to show you those videos. We'll spam you either way. But thanks much for watching, and until next time, game on.